Thank you so much for your opening remarks. And also, what a pleasure to be opening following a quote from our executive director. So, very kind of you. Thank you. Good morning and a warm welcome from my side. We had just heard it's the opening panel. We're very excited about that. Of the third and last day of the Data for Peace conference. My name is Alicia Kugel, and I am the lead for mediation and peace building at the Center for International Peace Operations, or CIF for short, based here in Berlin, Germany. And CIF was founded in 2002 by the German Bundestag and is a daughter organization of the Federal Foreign Office with a mandate to strengthen civilian crisis management. I would like to add that we are also having a project with the Federal Foreign Office specifically on mediation and peace building. And as part of this project, kindly funded by the Federal Foreign Office, we are conducting this webinar with you today. Branka, you mentioned it already. Crisis early warning systems are only as effective as the actions that they enable. Yet a persistent gap remains between early warning data generated on the ground and the extent to which it is translated into timely, context-sensitive responses by international actors in the field of peacekeeping and peace building. Digital tools have the potential, we also just heard, to transform conflict early warning by moving systems from reactive, slow-moving analysis to more proactive, data-driven and community-integrated operations. With this panel, with our panel today, we want to examine opportunities and tensions at the intersection of digital tools, international intervention, and community-based early warning action. And together with you, audience members, in the later part of the panel, we would like to identify practical pathways for more accountable, sustainable, and locally anchored early warning to response mechanisms. Now, in our discussion, we will be guided by some overarching questions, including who currently owns early warning, those who generate information, or those who control response mechanisms. What forms of local knowledge are most often lost, ignored, or transformed in international responses? And how can digital tools enhance responses without reinforcing extractive or top-down dynamics? I am extremely pleased to have a absolutely high caliber cast of panelists with us today that will help us answer some of these questions or investigate them further. And they have allowed me to only refer to them by their current position and organization because they have all very extensive experience, and probably we would need the entire time of the panel to introduce them properly. But you will find their bio notes in the chat for further information. And so with only very short introduction, I welcome to the panel Caleb Gichui, who is the Africa lead for Build Up. A warm welcome also to Imane Karimo, who is the UN representative of the Nonviolent Peace Force. Welcome also to Martin Wälisch, who is currently Associate Professor of Transformative Technologies, Innovation and Global Affairs at the University of Birmingham. And last but not least, of course, Theona Williams, who is the Senior Protection Advisor at the UN Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A warm welcome to all of you. Before we get started, just 2 words on our session structure. We will have 2 rounds of questions with our panelists, then followed for the majority of time with a Q&A with our audience. Please feel free to use the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen throughout the panel to ask or pose your questions or your insights. My colleagues will focus on the Q&A box and also aggregate some of the questions towards the end so we can really answer as many as possible. I have also in the pre-planning of this panel already given a heads up to the panelists that we have to really stick to our time limits. So apologies if I, with my big clock here, have a good eye on the time and have to cut you off in case it goes too long. But of course, we want to give you as much room as possible as well to enlighten us with your experience. With no further ado, I would then move to the first round of questions, which will focus on what actually works and why. And the panelists have about 3 to 4 minutes for their answers. And therefore, Theona, turning to you first. Protection of civilians through early warning and response is a key mandated task of the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to which from now on I will refer to by its acronym MONUSCO. Over the years, MONUSCO has expanded and strengthened its early warning system, including its situational awareness through improved analysis and information gathering systems. Theona, what models of collaboration between the mission and communities have successfully translated local warning signals into preventative action?
Thank you, Alicia, and good morning to everyone who's joined. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have been invited to represent MONUSCO on this panel. A really important topic that's definitely work in progress. But we do see, and we have developed a number of different models that do work. Can they work better? Yes. But do they work enough to save many lives? Yes, they do. So I'll just share a few, and I know the time is limited. So hopefully there'll be time for further questions and answers and further discussion. But let me just highlight a couple of on the ground, like real saving lives models. I would start by highlighting the local protection committees. Local protection committees, or LPCs, because everybody loves acronyms, they are local in terms of they're the communities themselves that formulate these committees with the support of the peacekeeping mission. And the emphasis of recent times has really been to make sure that those committees are representative of the communities. So there's been an effort by the mission to encourage and find women in particular to be members of those committees. And those committees, they combine, the function of them combines warning, like the warning generation, so the generation of warnings and alerts with locally driven responses. So it's not just alerts being given and then MONUSCO or the security forces responding. It's a very integrated model. LPCs also contribute to the situational awareness. They identify local conflict indicators, armed group activities, and basically emerging threats. So that helps us all improve on being more preventive. In certain locations, because of course it's very context specific. For those that know the DRC and Ituri province and Jugu territory in particular, there are many very large sites for displaced civilians. And so they also have their own committees that feed into these local protection committees. We also have community alert networks, CANs, and community alert networks are linked with the local protection committees and run by the local protection committees in large. And the community alert networks consist of phone hotlines using HF radios that are solar powered and different means basically for individuals to be able to raise the alarm when there's a threat to the safety and security of civilians. And this has helped, the use of HF radios, for example, has helped in isolated locations because it's really hard. There's still many areas that don't have phone networks or not reliable phone networks. Individuals, of course, sometimes don't have a phone or don't have data on their phone to be able to use that for raising the alerts.
Theona, sorry, we're already through the minutes.
Okay.
But thank you very much for highlighting both the LPCs and the CANs, another acronym, and especially how they are working together there, and also highlighting the role of women in these. We will, I'm sure, dive further into and also highlight further examples in our conversation. Imane, you also worked on unarmed civilian protection and community-based early warning in the context of DRC and elsewhere. In DRC, civilians caught up in the conflict are developing mechanisms to protect themselves. How do these efforts link up with what Theona was just explaining? And then how far have digital tools been used as enablers of collaboration and early warning response as part of these mechanisms?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you, everyone. Very pleased to be on this panel today. So indeed, the type of work that we do at Environmental Peace Force and that we support is really based on the recognition that civilians have a range of tools at their disposal to try and increase their safety in highly violent environments. And so you've mentioned DRC, we've seen it in DRC, but we've seen it also in other contexts, South Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine, the Philippines, and more. And I'll try to focus a little bit more on our Asia sort of case studies. So some of those tools are more remedial. So they will be responding to an incident that already happened, case management, referrals, negotiating prisoner release. But a lot of them are also much more preventive, so intended to prevent the occurrence of a violent incident through information sharing and action. So that will look like protective presence, protective accompaniment, rumor control, etc. And that's also definitely where e-war systems fit in as a self-protection tool. In terms of where we've seen, where civilians have coexisted with sort of a UN mission protection architecture, we don't have examples of like fully formal, jointly operated digital platforms or data sharing agreements or, communication protocol between civilian monitors and then peacekeeping missions per se. But what we do have is many instances where there were joint responses to a threat that was voiced or communicated by community members. So I can give an example in South Sudan, for example, in 2021, after, women that were residents of the former POC site in Bentiu, raised risks of gender-based violence that they were facing when going out of the, sites to collect firewood, for instance, in the bush. And so at the same time, you had the peacekeepers who usually were in charge of, that scheduling around accompanying them to collect the firewood. They became increasingly stretched in their operating area. And so they couldn't cover the fully weekly schedule anymore themselves. So my colleagues at the time worked with the mission in order to, divvy up essentially the slots in the week so that some of the protective accompaniment would be done by the peacekeepers and some of them would be done by our own sort of trained, unarmed civilian peacekeepers. And so we've really seen that type of collaboration in terms of the response, and that's proven quite useful. Just wanted to make a quick point here and go back to maybe something that Tiona was saying. I think we've seen over the years, in terms of looking at the collaboration between civilians and UN missions, slightly more integrated systems where you used to have a lot more like siloed approaches between the information sharing and the response. And I think that's a key difference between sort of e-war in, peacekeeping and then community-based e-war, which is who holds the sort of the response agency. And so as actors working on self-protection tools, the idea is really to say, how do we move between, we communicate information to external actors and they respond, to how do we respond collectively, or how do we respond ourselves when there are issues of access, for example. But we've also seen that work very well in contexts in which there is no UN peacekeeping mission. So in the Philippines, in Mindanao, for example, we've really worked with, a very wide array of networks to keep those two functions together, where they do the de-escalation, the rumor management, the negotiation with armed actors really themselves in response to what they've observed themselves. Really quickly on digital tools, I know I'm running out of time. So, I think there were mixed results there. We don't necessarily have examples of digital tools being enablers to how you work with UN missions, but more so with state actors and state structures. So in the Philippines, for example, our networks of community-based e-work groups there have used social media obviously way more in recent years and have seen how that's proven, how that has made information exchange much faster, which really helps with the warning aspect. So being able to relay to local authorities, a particular incident or threat or risk, and also how that creates the pressure and the public scrutiny for those external actors to respond quickly. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Imane, and for highlighting those different aspects, especially on the collaboration and also development into more integrated systems. That was great to hear. Caleb, turning over to you, as we've just heard, local agency in crisis early warning is crucial for the provision of contextual assessment, providing granular knowledge on community behaviors and socioeconomic vulnerabilities. How can local actors then move from data providers and have response agency, as Imane just called it, to genuine co-owners of early warning and response processes? And thank you for sharing an example of your work there.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone organizing this conference. So I think there are two things that we've seen in the work that we've done that has been quite useful in moving that needle from just having people become data providers, right? So you just don't want to count people as metrics, but you want to have them included in some of these processes. So in particularly 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea-Bissau, what we've done is basically including communities from the beginning of the process, right? So if you want to run, let's say, a early warning, early response program, then the first thing is, we usually tend to have a top-down approach where it's like there's a conflict here, people can support with knowledge, and then we can respond. Whoever that is we, then sometimes is devoid of the community. So including the communities from the beginning, what it means is this idea of a participatory data process, right? So one is they are the data providers. Yes, this is what we've known them to be, but then also they're not just providing the data. What they're also being included in as the very beginning of the questionnaire development process. So think of communities almost being part of saying, what do we want to collect in our communities? Instead of us bringing the questionnaires and saying, well, this is what we want to know from you, and then they give us everything that they have. So what that allows them to do is, one, create channels of things that are important to them, because sometimes we miss a lot of the processes that happen in those communities, and those processes have things of importance to them. So for instance, like how do people communicate, which areas do they gather information where they think is trusted. So when you have them creating part of the question, or collectively creating the questionnaires, then you're embedding that knowledge within the questionnaire. So you're not just going to them with something that you want, but you're also allowing them to collect things that they're also interested in. And then the collection process, of course, is done by them, because even when you're introducing technologies, sometimes we tend to skip the fact that these technologies need to be trusted. So you have communities who carry that trust to their own members. So one, you also have them collect the data. But then the interesting bit is the analysis. So what we usually see is data is collected and then analyzed in a very different location, even outside the country, even with a specialist sitting somewhere in a different country, and then who gives a report and say, this is what the community is doing, or these are the trends in the community. But what you want to do is inculcate the idea of how do we analyze the data sets together. So that's where technology comes into play. So if you're introducing graphs and charts, you're almost introducing the idea of a chart to a community that perhaps has never looked at a chart before. So you're not just saying, okay, we're just going to introduce a chart there, but you're also trying to figure out, is this going to be useful? If that is not going to be useful, how else can we do it, right? So is it actually drawings of the data in a different way that makes the community understand it? Because what you want to do here is help them analyze, or you're not helping them, but you're co-analyzing with them. And the reason here is, there are some trends that we might not understand the reasons behind, but they have the knowledge to actually tell you this is why this is happening when they look at the data. So you're not just analyzing the data, but you're also providing the basis of why the findings are the way they are.
Perfect.
And then the last,
Caleb.
yeah.
Oh, okay. One last sentence, because
Yeah.
then you are out of time.
Yeah, just the last bit is to say that beyond that, you also want them to have the autonomy to say, this is what you want to use the data for. So in those countries, we've had them bring the data to security officials to address early warning, early response issues, and to say, here's a problem here, and the data proves it. So it's not just anecdotal. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caleb, and also for highlighting aspects that Pranka already mentioned as well, the trust needed also in the use of technology. And another one is really the having the data provided, but then also the analysis of the data that often takes place somewhere else, and how technology can help to have a collaboration in that aspect as well. Thank you very much. Martin, turning to you. Observers raise concerns about the collection and use of data by international actors, reinforcing extractive dynamics. How can digital tools strengthen the coordination and trust between local and international actors? Caleb already alluded to that fact just now, but without reinforcing these types of dynamics. And what are examples there of good practice, maybe building on to what Caleb just shared with us?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alicia. And I think the example Caleb just gave us from build-up is a good one, because I think the truth is that the majority of early warning systems, the ones that are heavily funded, they feel like dashboards built for bureaucrats in New York and Geneva, not really for the communities that affect them. So it feels like, communities are observed but not really served. And I think one point that Khaled pointed to is this element of co-designing and creating co-governance, right? I think that's one key principle and hopefully emerging in good practice. There are a few other examples one could mention. One that comes to my mind is really everyday peace indicators, an initiative that puts communities together to define what peace and what stability actually means. So shared governance, that I think is a good emerging principle. Second one is really around transparency. And we heard an example, from our UN colleague on this, where people need to know what data is collected and who can access it and how. And there are good examples, like think about the Center for Civilian and Conflict and the kind of local human rights monitor initiatives where data donations happen and the participants know kind of what is done with that, and they voluntarily share this. So transparency, I think, is a second good principle. And the third one is really reciprocity. When kind of communities receive feedback on what they kind of contribute. And obviously, like one could argue from a kind of the global north perspective, well, the aid is delivered or the attention is given, right? But that's not really enough. So I think kind of what we need are better platforms where reciprocity is happening. And I think good examples there are like things around agriculture, where we have data sharing from the whole world, where all parts of the world kind of benefit from data. And the second one that comes to my mind, and has been spoken about at the conference, is OpenStreetMap, right? Where you have humanitarian mapping happening that is collaborative and where you see that element of reciprocity.
Thank you. And also thank you for really sticking to your time and highlighting the three important aspects: shared governance, transparency, and the reciprocity. So really giving feedback to data that has been provided, so it doesn't just go in one black hole and then people never hear about it again. Thank you, everyone, for a really great input in our first round. We are currently uploading the bios in the chat. I'm doing that because we have posted it in the Q&A part, but we're not sure if everyone else can see your bios. So bear with me while we're doing that, so everyone can really know about your great experience here. We are now moving into the second round of questions. It's a little bit shorter, about 2 to maximum 3 minutes for each respondent again. And here we're looking at addressing challenges. And a few challenges have been mentioned already that we can build on. Feel free also to mention maybe further challenges. And we really want to focus on pathways out of those, or how to address them. And Iman, I would like to start with you. Through your work at the local level, and you've mentioned various contexts already, you have encountered potential risks and concerns around communities providing data on conflict early warning. What safeguards are needed to mitigate risks at local to local communities and frontline responders, particularly in contexts of surveillance, political sensitivity, or unequal power relations?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. So I think for us, from our perspective and our work, there definitely will always need to be, some level of guardrails when working with community-based e-war networks, and especially when it involves introducing some kind of new technology. I think one of the sort of the overarching question for us will be like, what do communities actually need to know to increase their safety? And as Caleb was saying, who defines those indicators and to what end? So we have examples of, really sort of harsh environments in which monitors, sort of coexist where technology is used as a political means to undermine their work. That's sort of at best, and at worst to truly target them as civilians, right? And to cause that harm. So in Kachin State, for instance, in Myanmar, we've seen surveillance, we've seen confiscation of devices at checkpoints, we've seen, re-identification of sources just through even patterns of how they were reporting and from where. So those are things that we cannot sort of overlook, and we constantly have to continue analyzing and risk mitigate when we involve our monitors. So just a few things on what we do to help keep the monitors safe. One, I think, sort of guideline is don't collect data that you essentially cannot protect. So as I've said, there's a bit of that mindset culture with monitors where we're used to sort of producing and extracting and sending over, abroad. But what we're saying is, if we know, if there is already pre-analysis around the likelihood of action, so if you can't act quickly on, what you are reporting on or what you're identifying, then you may just be creating additional risks to the person who's providing the information. So don't ask for what you can't respond to, essentially. Then in terms of like principles of EWAR, one that is crucial and key for us is nonpartisanship. So in the Philippines, we're very clear on this. In Mindanao, for instance, people who are affiliated with clans or have some sort of political ties cannot be involved in the first place. Or if they get involved in a group and sort of that changes midway, then they will step back so that they do not compromise the rest of the group, and sort of the group doesn't become vulnerable to things like co-optation and stuff like that. So making sure that we continuously sort of check for nonpartisanship of our monitors is really important. And then lastly, the acceptance of the monitors themselves. So at NP, and generally in protection work, we really sort of value this relationships-based, aspect to protection, and the idea that there needs to be constant and continuous acceptance of the monitors themselves as people, but as a consequence also of their data, right? So who trusts your monitors? Who recognizes them? Is their information seen as credible? And that needs to be reassessed constantly, because in those environments, there's a lot of volatility, a lot of turnover. So there can be a new military commander, after a couple of months, there can be a new police chief, there can be, a new teacher or whatnot, a new local authority. And so the sort of monitor's profile may be interpreted differently. So we really continuously need to, continue building those relationships and making sure that they keep on being perceived as trustworthy and credible, because that will increase their own safety.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Imane, for those for highlighting those approaches. And I think something that sticks out is the continuity that's important there. So that it has to be an ongoing process of reassessing and really evaluating who you're engaging with, on what terms, and so forth. I'm now moving to our next question, and that is Caleb, looking in your direction. In working with local partners and efforts to strengthen responsible data use and management, you are also very aware of potential risks and challenges. And I would like to ask you in particular, how do you think data ownership, consent, and digital security should be addressed in fragile contexts?
Yeah, very interesting questions, and I resonate with what Imane said. But I also want to add that I think the first thing we want to share with them is the value of the data brings risks with it. So sometimes there is a lack of understanding of what that value is, and also the risk that attaches to that value, because sometimes that data will point to government being the perpetrator of violence against its own community, and communities then are put at risk. So I agreed with you, don't necessarily collect data that you can protect, and also data that you do not need. But the other bit I wanted to add was two things. One, on technology being useful to reach people who are at risk, because sometimes in this fragile context, going door to door, collecting data, maybe through tools like Kobo Toolbox, that may be challenging, because then you are seen as collecting data, and once the results are out, people can then be targeted. So we've seen technologies being useful, even in spaces where we've told people, once you finish collecting your data, providing your data, you can actually delete the link or the app so that you not are connected to that platform, just to show them that that is a secure process, or anonymity, full anonymity that you cannot trace back to the user. But then also one other thing is this idea of collective ownership versus institutional or individual ownership, where we've seen civil society organizations collect data, and then they're put at risk because they're seen as the producer of the report, and they're easily targeted. But when it's collective ownership, data collected by the community, analyzed by the community, then it becomes very challenging to say who is the community that we can target, right? When the community is actually a mix of different people, individuals, and society institutions. So I think those layers allow us to navigate these spaces. Like in Ethiopia, we've seen these challenges quite drastically rise. And these are the steps that we've taken to address some of these processes. Yeah.
Hey, sorry, I couldn't find my microphone. Thank you, Caleb, so much for highlighting that. And I think the aspect of collective ownership, as you said, is something really interesting. And also that maybe in the use of technologies can also be enhanced again on the collective side. Teona, turning to you. Missions are extremely complex structures with a host of different interlocutors on the national, local, and international side. And at present, as everyone else, shrinking resources in a contentious political environment. What operational or political bottlenecks between warning and response have you experienced in MONUSCO, and what can be done to address these?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Really building on what Iman and Caleb have been sharing, and Martin and before, very helpful comments. The kind of baseline is like, of course, those are all challenges, all of those coordination issues. They are always, and especially in a large political organization like the UN. And so we have lots of different mechanisms internally to try and overcome the coordination and enhance the joint working. Increasingly, because we're in a transition kind of mindset, as we always should be, and certainly are at the moment, it's all about working jointly, enabling and finding ways for state and non-state protection actors to be able to be in the lead, for us to be responding to them. As everybody will know, probably it's a long-standing mission. So those are some deep kind of historical patterns of working that we're working towards shifting in the right direction. The operational and the political challenges meet on the ground, of course. So, and we're very low tech, to be honest, as you're probably picking up, relative to some other entities. But that has to meet the need on the ground, right? So that's why much of what we do is quite low tech at the moment. Of course, the operational challenges are things like communication, freedom of movement ourselves, and the lack of capacity that you highlight, Alicia, in the question. But then the political, we're very much impacted by the mis and disinformation, sometimes malinformation. Many people that we're serving are easy to influence for different reasons, and social media really plays its part, either positively or negatively, often in our case negatively. And so that mis and disinformation can lead to either no information being received for us to be able to respond, or the wrong information, or a lack of trust. That trust has been raised by my colleagues, a lack of trust, meaning that more people are left in harm because we're either stopped through misunderstanding of our mandate or our purpose on the ground, or we're in the wrong place, or we're blocked, or something similar. So those challenges are very real. What do we do? I think our analysis and the emphasis on the joint analysis, I really support. Really learning together what the trends are, where the hotspots are, what's changing, where there are successes, and really as a mission being adaptive to that. So our military force, which is often what people see first when they think of a peacekeeping mission, their flexibility, their mobility is really something that the force commander of the mission has been working on. So we're much more agile rather than being stuck in one place.
Fiona, I'm so sorry I have to interrupt you here, but I think we can pick up in the Q&A on some of the things that you mentioned. And interestingly, I think you said that your approaches are quite low tech, but in an environment that's quite high tech in terms of mis and disinformation and the speed of which information and misinformation also spreads. So that's an interesting tension there. We're now, the last question goes to Martin in our second round before we open the floor to the Q&A. And I encourage everyone in the audience to already start putting questions in the Q&A so we can collect those and aggregate them and have our great panelists speak to those. Martin, as we just mentioned, there's a huge resource issue currently in our field. MONUSCO was considered to draw down for a while. Now it's a bit more stable, but still facing extreme budget cuts as well as other entities. And peacebuilding actors across the board, also financed through bilateral donors, are facing resource issues. What happens to locally rooted early warning mechanisms when external funding ends or peace operations, such as MONUSCO, draw down? To what extent can digital tools ensure sustainability of local early warning mechanisms?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I think we have good empirical evidence, over decades now that when engagement on peace declines, war reemerges. So not to be the level, here in the room, but like unfortunately, we see then usually a recurrent pattern if institutions are not strengthened to an extent where we have mechanisms in place to absorb those tensions, without the resort to arms. And I think what we will face, and I say this now with my scientist hat on, I'm curious to see how kind of the absence of funding will unfortunately kind of create potentially further mess. And this emergence, this plethora of dashboards and early warning systems that we've seen over the last years. Although I would argue that funding for peace initiatives has been always limited if you compare this to military spending. One needs to see how this plays out. Now, here are a few thoughts. One is I think it's good that we have initiatives like CRAFT, which also fund this conference here, which is basically an initiative to pool funding to allow infrastructures to survive. I think that's kind of a critical part. Because the truth is that technology itself does not create sustainability, but like institutions do and local ownership, and that needs kind of sustained engagement. Now, here's one example, I think, where we've seen this sustained engagement disregard the ups and downs of political dynamics, which is Oshahidi, right? I mean, many of us know about them and have interacted with them, contributed and so forth, and which really kind of started as a crisis mapping project, and Hala can probably say more about this as well, and then became part of an infrastructure, right? So it's not just a project that maybe started as a project, not just a project anymore, but it's now part of an infrastructure. And that kind of goes beyond donor-funded dashboards. Obviously, they depend on external funding, but the movement is much larger. Example one. Second one, I think, is WANEP, West African Network for Peacebuilding, also which started like as a community-based early warning network, has seen multiple iterations of dashboards and technologies, and now is really integrated within the ECOWAS, ecosystem, and can't be really just like disentangled so quickly anymore. Another good example, kind of where the technology has changed, but the relationships with institutions have remained, right? And I think that's what the key part is, that early warning systems will survive, not because of the technology, because of the people and the links that were built, and the software might not survive, but like those larger institutional ties, make peace possible in the long run.
Thank you, Martin, and also thank you for highlighting once more the importance of the interpersonal relations and also the really, as you said, the ecosystems, the institutional ecosystems, and how they have to incorporate local also early warning systems. I'm taking a look at the chat, and so far there's one question. Two, in fact, one from my colleague who's first in the chat here, and that goes to Tiona. Tiona, you just spoke about the historical patterns of working of MONUSCO, and MONUSCO, for those who don't know the mission, has been in place for over 30 years, if I'm correct. So really speaking of historical patterns of working. But in how far can tech maybe help to maybe break those historical patterns of working and engaging in your field of work?
Yeah, thank you. We're not quite as old as you say.
Not 30? No, okay. It
It's
feels like.
fine. 20, 25 years.
Okay.
And I think also just picking up on your last summary of what I said, I don't see it that we are working low tech in a high tech environment. I don't see it as a high-tech environment in terms of protection. It's very basic. It's people raising the alarm however they can to get a response as quickly as they can, or to provide a response as quickly as they can. But tech does help, of course, and it is helping. I was beginning to say before the role of the analysis. I think tech really helps in the analysis piece. But also, of course, we do have assets as a large peacekeeping mission, and the military assets really, really help. So our surveillance mechanisms, the unarmed aerial surveillance that we have, the drones. So we have very few, and we have, recent years we've got less than we had because of the cuts, the funding cuts. But realizing the nature of the violence, we are looking to make sure we have the assets to be able to meet those needs. So if, for example, the drones have to be able to, the armed groups fight in the deep canopy of the forest. So, and they're very agile, one group in particular, the ADF, very agile, very strategic, move in small groups. So we've tried many different means, but that piece of tech of having drones that can go through, penetrate through the canopy of a jungle, absolutely essential. So there's kind of very big, obvious tech pieces like that. And then the low tech stuff, which for me is the WhatsApp groups and the, various use of whatever communities have. And it includes, we don't have tech on some situations. I remember examples of, people walking miles to be able to get to the nearest base that we have to be able to raise the alarm, or getting on a bike. I mean, so that when I'm talking about low tech, it's trying to meet, we have to meet the reality. There's many more examples, but I'll stop there because of time. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we look at the further questions to see if there's more we can dive into. But thank you, Teona. Another question here is I'll just read it out briefly. From a data perspective, we have more early warning information than ever before. Yet many crises still surprise the international community. And the question is, what is the bigger challenge today? Generating better warnings or creating institutions that are willing and able to act on them? Martin, maybe I'll push that one towards you because you have been speaking about the institutional ecosystem, but anyone else who would like to chime in, feel free to do so.
Thanks for the question. It feels like a rhetorical one. Like who would say now, well, we need more early warning, but we need less early action, right? This has been always a slippery slope. I think what I would add here is that we're losing a sense for storytelling. We're losing a sense kind of for really detecting emotion. Well, we're living in this world of datafication, right? And that is a big risk because then we create another piece of technology to sift through the vast amount of data that we have been collecting. And this is kind of, kind of a chicken and egg principle. So I often feel, should we rather leave the dashboards out of the conversation to have emotional responses, to have a real conversation, right? But again, long-standing debate, as we're trying to tame this beast that we call conflict prevention.
Thank you, Martin. Another question in the chat is a little bit rhetorical again, but I'll take it. We often talk about a gap between early warning and early action. Is that really a data problem or is it an accountability problem? Who should be held responsible when the warning exists but the action never follows? I don't know if there's any volunteer takers of that question. If not, then maybe I look in Imane's direction if she wants to tackle that one.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I think it's definitely something that we would agree with in terms of sort of the broader picture. And I think we've always been clear working with community-based e-war networks that, if communities or community members continue to see that the risks that they take to, provide feedback or feed systems with information aren't worthwhile insofar as they basically don't lead to action, then they may very well stop. And so that will make the system only more blind to what's actually happening on the ground and to the actual, it will make institutions less situationally aware, let's say it like that. And so we are really risking this cycle of sort of self-reinforcing exclusion. And that's something that's extremely worrying. I will say though, from our perspective, that is why, in order to make sure that those systems are sustainable, we should work on reducing their reliance on external action, right? So work more on indigenous responses, indigenous response agency as much as you can. Obviously, sometimes the risk level attains a certain threshold where you would need external action, and then we need to have those conversations. But also, there's a lot of things that people can do at the grassroots level where they might just need a little push, So it's about like, how do we use our role as facilitators of those conversations? What do we have at our disposal? Let's look around. Where are safe passage? How do we want to map it? Who's our focal point for XYZ? Like, communities have that agency. So let's work on that. So that, we reduce that dependency and that reliance essentially.
Oh, excellent. Thank you again for once more really drawing on the human aspects there and the knowledge that's already existing on the field level that can be enhanced further or rediscovered in some aspects or in some cases as well. A question that's also out there, maybe Caleb, in your direction. As AI-based forecasting tools become more sophisticated, what types of local knowledge remain difficult or impossible for algorithms to capture?
Yeah, I think I'll borrow what Martin says, and I think it's the same thing of building new tools that can still continue analyzing our data sets while we are missing the subtle cues that exist within community engagement. So the fact that people have tensions, how do you map tensions on an AI, right? Just what do you mean by tension, right? Because you're moving away from event-based data sets into almost like emotional wave-like the data set, right? So, and this is where conflict sits, right? So when people say we are feeling very tense and nervous about the situation, and you can tell whether that is rising or declining. So I think the art of community engagement, storytelling, and just learning from patterns within processes that exist in those communities is still going to be missed, because a lot of the data on conflict focuses on metrics around events, number of deaths, number of attacks, all these like metric type data sets that don't necessarily show the whole spectrum of what a conflict is. So I think we're going to miss the unseen, the almost like the emotional waves that exist in conflicts. These communities hold and are really useful, especially in early warning.
Thank you again so much for elaborating on that. I'm inviting our audience members again for more questions to our panel. But another one that came up was, and yeah, again, I don't have a certain person to target that one for, maybe whoever feels most confident about it. Are there risks that decision makers place greater trust and decision makers often removed, right, from the local level as such in predictive models than more trust in those models than in local actors who may see warning signs first? And again, there, Caleb, I think you just mentioned about the aspects of emotions, of feelings, that something is going astray on the community level. So how to deal with that? The risk that decision makers may place greater trust in these predictive models than in local actors.
I'll just jump in to say we need to ask ourselves who the decision makers are. And if they're all external, then there's a problem. So, yeah.
I think that's a great point to see who is calling the shots at the end, and that's was one of the overarching questions that we also were looking at here. Excellent. Let me just have another look in the chat. I think there was another question that popped up.
Just maybe really quick.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure.
Go ahead.
No,
No,
go
if
ahead.
there's a question, please feel free.
No, please do answer that. I have to. It's
Okay.
rather long, so I'm gonna read it at the
Okay.
same time as you
No,
speak.
just very quickly wanted to go back, and I think it's partly answers your question to the sort of a whole discussion around indicators and who defines them and what is seen as sort of credible data. Because I think there's an issue with filtering, basically. As soon as the data sort of leaves community, members and gets to decision makers, albeit external decision makers, we've seen in communities in South Sudan or even in Mindanao, like things like dreams are treated as predictive indicators, or things like, so how women sort of like patterns of how many women show up at a market, or how maybe youth are mobilized or stuff like that. These are highly, highly context specific indicators that have very real predictive value for those who live in those contexts. But that's where the trust discussion has to come in, right? So it's like what looks like data. And I guess it's a sort of a loop again to this whole emotional discussion around some things seem very intangible, but we need to trust, the people who are providing us with that analysis to say, no, that means something to us. And, let's act together and believe us in that. So I think that's part of the issue in terms of sort of conflict prevention and prediction from the outside of risks and of threats of violence, is what is treated as credible, who defines those indicators, and really, really working on this, because it's almost a mindset change that needs to happen, I would say, at the institutional level.
And I'm
Excellent.
going to
Thank you
also
so
just really jump in on that, because I think that I find that really interesting. And I'm an anthropologist, and we need, I think that anthropological approach is really important. And it's extremely challenging now in this social media world, to be able to go with information. How it raises a question of how you verify. What do you use to actually conclude when you're trying to work out what's legitimate information to act on and what isn't? It's extremely complex now when you've got low trust or no trust and mis or disinformation. Thanks.
Thank you so much again for highlighting those aspects. We have a question in the chat, and I was just reminded we have a little less than 10 minutes left for our panel. A question from the context of South Sudan. By the time in South Sudan we have early warning signs, it would be too late to provide accurate intervention. Why can't institutions focus on mitigating the early warning signs? What needs to be done in this case? It's a tough one. I don't know, Tiona, if that speaks to you.
Yeah, for sure it does. And it's for me, it's not really just a question around data, but it's the journey towards being more preventive, right? That's how I understand the question. And we've, through all of our inputs, I think we've given various different examples of models that and initiatives that can work. There's many, but so I don't want to take more time to go over them. But I think that is the journey we're on, right? How to get more preventive. Of course, we have to mitigate, and so prevent, mitigate, respond. There's kind of like almost like a sequencing. It doesn't happen in sequence, but we absolutely have to be working towards addressing that point. So thank you to whoever gave that question.
Thank you for answering it. One last question I see here, and then we're gonna have some final remarks of the panel, and then our time is already over. This question is, do you have a practical example? It's not targeted to any specific speaker. Do you have a practical example of a country region where local knowledge has been integrated in official conflict prevention plans in a non-extractive way? And how was it done? What were the steps to persuade local decision makers? Yeah. Again, I think what officials are we talking about? I assume it's on the national level. Caleb, I don't know if you have an example on that side.
Yeah, very quickly. In Kenya, we've seen this happen, and what the process was like what I've mentioned earlier, where data collection started from the community driving the process, saying this is what we want to collect, and then informing also the early responders and institutions that this is what you're going to be collecting and this is what you require from me, almost like informing them in advance. And then keep on sharing that loop. And when that happened, when the information was shared to the early responders, the follow-up was, what did you use the information for? So that kept on happening for some time until the responders realized that there's somebody actually holding us to account as opposed to just waiting us to respond. And that loop started becoming a bit more structured to a point where now when they started responding, the almost accountability bit started relaxing to a point where people could actually see that the early warning was resulting into some of the prevention mechanisms. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caleb. Now we are 5 minutes we have left, and I would like to turn to all of you, dear panelists, if there's anything that has come to mind in the last hour that you would like to add or comment on before we close, any unspoken words that you would like to share, or anything that came up in the discussion or questions indeed that you would like to address. No, everything was clear.
Just super tiny addition that I think is something that surfaced from my colleagues who are still based in Myanmar that I thought was quite interesting, is something not to overlook is how a lot of these community-based systems are volunteer-based. And so there will always be that sort of monetary aspect to factor in when you're thinking about sustainability. So it's not just, sort of the architecture, the structure of who provides the information, who responds, but also, a lot of them are maybe staffers of INGOs who are based in all of these countries. When the IGOs leave and the funding sort of contracts, are people going to continue if there's only 24 hours in the day? There are things that you need to do for your own livelihood. How much time can you afford to this system and keeping it alive? So I think part of the reflections we're also having is what are some of the sort of self-financing mechanisms we can find for community-based e-work groups so that they stay and remain sustainable and less dependent on external funding. So I think just something to throw in as well.
Excellent point. Thank you. Teona.
Yeah, also, I think it's worth highlighting the importance. One of the roles we play, but many actors, I think we all play, is using digital tools and data to raise attention globally or to whichever broader audience, so that some of the forgotten conflicts or some of the degree of suffering in different remote locations or that don't always get the headlines, that we can use data and use our digital tools to raise awareness to those that can make a difference in kind of the big political decisions that get made. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for highlighting that. Martin, any last words?
Yeah, I think this is like really a catch-22 that we are facing, right? On one side, we're asking for more technology to make kind of early warning sharper and kind of more sophisticated. And then on the other side, there's this kind of demand for human storytelling, human judgment, right? Greater trust and to act on it. So I think this tension will never disappear, right? It's part of kind of the process. But I think the deeper question is kind of, how not to choose between the data or intuition on the other side, but how do we make this handoff of the data collection more explicit? Like what does the system know? How is the system created? Who interprets it? Who is accountable for the decision that follow or don't follow? I think there we need more research and we need deeper reflection because apparently we haven't really figured it out yet.
Excellent point. Thank you. Caleb, very briefly, because we only have 2 minutes left.
Just to say that I think response should not be only left to institutions, but communities themselves have capacity to respond. And also we should value response as much as we value the early warning, because we put a lot of emphasis on data collection, accuracy, data tools. But then when it comes to response, it's like, oh, who's available? It's just almost left to like one institution. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, to all of you for your time, for sharing your insights, and also for really sharing your vast experience with all of us. And thank you, of course, to the audience members for also posting really interesting questions in the chat, for following our conversations. I have posted now, or I will post it right now in the chat, a link to a QR code for an evaluation of our discussion here today. I'm grateful if people could follow the link and send us an evaluation. Other than that, with only 1 minute to spare, also thank you, of course, to Branka Panic and all the organizers of the Data for Peace conference, and we look forward to joining the rest of the day today as we can, and follow your conference.